Welcome back! Now, in the last lesson, we moved our fetch collection start async method into our component did mount. We also wrote this asynchronous Redux thunk method in order to kick off multiple actions, including updating our reducer to being able to handle the asynchronous nature and state of our shop-related API requests related to our collections and getting said collections from Firebase. Well, one issue you might have noticed, or if you haven't, I'm going to show you, is that if you go to some collection page and you refresh, you'll actually see that it breaks. The reason being that it cannot read property title of null, meaning that the collection object is equal to null when it tries to destructure title off of it. Well, why is this happening? Well, we know that what we've done inside of our shop is we're passing in this collection page with spinner. And our spinner should be rendering a loading screen if our collections is empty. That's the only possible way for our selector to be giving us a null collection object. And if we look at the actions, we'll see that this is totally the case. When our error logs, the previous state that we can see get logged by our action and Redux logger is such that our shop is in its initial state. If we scroll down after, we'll actually see that our action doesn't even fire because our app breaks at that point. So why is this happening? Well, as we know, we put our async method inside of component did mount. Component did mount mounts after the initial render call, meaning that when our first render call gets called on our shop component, is fetching collections is using the default fetching value, which is false. And passing false into our higher order component with spinner will cause it not to render the spinner and instead render our wrapped component because is loading is false. This is totally expected behavior given how our code is. But the problem with this is that our collection component, when it initializes and renders, it expects there to be some collections in order for it to actually render any state. Well, this becomes a problem for us because we need to use a different selector rather than just checking whether or not our collections is being fetched. This is totally normal. In many components where we can possibly wait before initializing a page where some value is definitely expected to be there, we can use our isLoading as normal. We don't want to ever move any of our API requests into the lifecycle method that occurs before component did mount, which is our constructor. We don't want to move our method in here. That's a bad pattern. It's an anti-pattern. The reason for this is because whenever a dispatch occurs inside of our application, it triggers any connected component, right, to re-render because it calls set state in order for those connected components to get new values from the state. We don't want this. This is a bad pattern. The reason why it's a bad pattern is because it causes all kinds of different render states to happen, right? You just don't want to do this in the constructor. It's highly suggested we move all of our API requests inside of component did mount. The other method you might see in some applications to use is a method called unsafe component will mount. This method is also a lifecycle method that we have access to, but it is not a method that we should be using, hence why it's flagged unsafe. Applications before React 16 were using this method to fire off asynchronous event handling because it's before the component mounts. So it actually does get fired before our render statement. However, React determined that it's unsafe because of the newest version of React. All these unsafe methods actually fire multiple times due to the way that they're rendering now. So it's not a good idea to fire multiple API requests inside of here. In fact, in general, we should deprecate usage of this method, which is fine for us. We'll just figure out how to use our existing best pattern, which is to fire off all our API requests inside of component did mount. What we have to do instead is just make a new selector for this isLoading value, where instead of checking whether or not collections is fetching, we need to check whether or not the collections value is actually loaded. So what we can do with that is we can write a new shop selector, and we can just call it const select is collections loaded. And what this does is it essentially just determines and returns us a Boolean value of whether or not our collection is null or not. So what we'll do is we will say shop, because we're just selecting our shop reducer, and we'll say shop.collections, right? So that's what we want to return, but we want to convert it to a Boolean value. We know that default value is null, and any other object value is going to be valid. So I'm going to show you a shorthand of converting a value to a truthy or falsy Boolean value. It's actually using the double bang if you've never seen this before. If you call a double bang on any falsy value, such as 0, you will get the actual Boolean value. This also works for empty strings and anything else that evaluates to false, including null. Now, we know that if we do any kind of object, including an empty object, we'll get true. So if our collections is loaded, we'll get true, otherwise we'll get false, which is what we want to return from this selector. So now, if we pull this into our component, we can add it to our map state to props value as is collection loaded. And then we can pass now this into our collections page with spinner as is loading value instead of our is fetching collections. So we'll continue destructuring off of props. One thing we have to remember is that the value will be inverted compared to what our is loading is expecting. So if our is collection loaded is false, right? So if our collection is not loaded, then what we want to pass is that the is loading is true, right? We want to tell our spinner to render. So we actually need to reverse this value. Now, I know it seems kind of confusing because we've converted it in our selector and then we converted it here, but let's just think about this. Our selector checks to see if our collections is loaded. If there's no collections, then the collections loaded is false, right? It's not true that our collections is loaded. So our select is collections loaded will be false if there's no collections. So if is collections loaded is false, if we pass false into is loading, we're just going to render our wrapper because our collections page with spinner only renders the spinner if is loading is true, which means that if there's no collection, we want to tell that it's true, which is why we need to reverse the value here. So now if we save and we go to our application, we'll see that it works as we expect it to, just like that. So it's a little bit of a complicated thing that we have to do here, but that's all it really comes down to, is just that we need to make sure to do a new selector just based on the way that our application is set up. This just goes to show you that there's multiple ways that applications might be, right? You might walk into an application where there are certain circumstances that prevent you from utilizing your pattern the full optimal way you want to, which is 100% fine. 99% of projects are not going to be perfect. You just have to think about the things that we've learned and where we got to put our logic, right? Think about one that makes the most sense to you inside of the right places, right? As we know where to keep our logic and separate our concerns out into and add them there accordingly. It's perfectly fine. The more you code, the more you will come across these situations where you need to come up with a solution that is good enough for you on the spot. And then from there is the only way you'll learn, right? Because this right now causes no problems for us. And this is actually a very valid way for us to determine whether or not our collections has been properly loaded in order for us to leverage our loading spinner state. I know it's been a mouthful, and I know these lessons are complicated. I definitely know. But I promise you, this is going to be a very, very wonderful experience for you to practice with, because only by pushing yourselves with these difficult problems are we going to see all the possible solutions we can take. Now, in the next lesson, we are going to focus on moving our selectors, where we have currently with our map states of props, into their own component. Because as we can see right now, the only thing our shop page does with these selectors that we've pulled in is pass them into these components. So it doesn't make sense to keep this logic on our shop app. Instead, what we should do is move them into this component somehow. And I'll show you how we can do that in the next lesson.